Tom Gumbleton, what comes to your mind when you think of Tom?
When I think of Tom Gumbleton, I think of someone who really cares about justice and is willing not only to talk about it, but to live it. And someone with a lot of guts and a lot of heart and soul, someone who understands community, someone who is willing to lead and take positions, difficult positions sometimes which aren't popular. Someone which I think the church ought to be more about.
You know, and jumping right there, you know, it seems like, you know, Tom is out of sync with the current Catholic Church, you know, but is it really the church is out of sync with Jesus or out of sync with what it really
I think the church is out of sync with the teachings of Christ. I think the church is out of sync with the sense of community, and I think Tom Gumbleton understands that. Tom Gumbleton understands very well, as many of us, I think, do, what the Vatican II was all about, what Pope John Paul XXIII was all about. And they were about community. They were about liberating people from oppression and injustice and broadening the message of Christ as he did with his disciples in the sense of community. And today the church is, regretfully, it's so conservative and so inbred and so lacking in its compassion and understanding for those who do not have, that it's changed its mission, and it's why it's having such difficulty internally and why it will continue to have, I think, difficulty attracting followers.
You know, you brought up Vatican II, and you know, I was a young kid at Vatican II. You know, and I guess I've learned more about Vatican II now, and the importance of it. And both Father Thomas and Tom Gumbleton go back to Vatican II all the time. I mean, I didn't realize what a huge change that was, and it seems like the church wants to go back and undo all those things. You know, why would that be bad? Why would it be bad to undo Vatican II?
Well, Vatican II taught about community. That community not only starts in a parish along Grand River, but what affects one person can affect another community, another country, another people. We live in a society today even more bound by technology and by communications, and what one reaction results in is oftentimes a reaction that can affect people far away. So we are, in many sense, a larger community, but the good works that we do individually within our own special community that we belong to, our parishes, can have enormous implications for others around the world. And Vatican II basically taught that you should reach out to those who are dispossessed, that don't have, that they're part of the family, and that they have to be considered in the overall scheme of what's happening in the world today.
Tom was the youngest bishop, I guess, ordained or appointed back whenever in the 60s or whenever he was appointed bishop, and now he's the oldest active bishop. But he doesn't fit in with the other bishops really. You know, how is Tom different than?
Well, there are some bishops he fits in with, but not very many anymore. He's outgoing. He's a doer. I mean, whether he's in Iraq or in Haiti or in Central America, he's there doing God's work. He's advocating for justice. He's speaking about hunger. He's speaking about poverty. He's speaking about the ability to work. He's speaking about fair trade. He's speaking about racism. He's speaking about colonialism and imperialism. He's speaking about the issues that people don't talk about a lot today, but they're there. Even in our own country, we have almost 40 million people who live in poverty today, here in the United States. He talks about these issues in a way that I think we need more of, because these problems are only festering, only growing, and until people are willing to discuss them, we're not going to make any progress on them.
You know, whether it's Haiti or Iraq or even New Orleans, you know, what is this lesson that we need to learn that we're just not learning? I mean, what is Tom trying to tell us?
Well, a just society takes care of all their brothers and sisters and works with them. They don't just forget about them. New Orleans is a good example. I used to go down to New Orleans often to speak at conventions. I always had this dual feeling about New Orleans. It was kind of a nice, funky place because of the music and the food. But, you know, my wife and I like to walk, so when we go, we used to walk throughout the whole city. Places where people say you can't go there, we used to go there. When people tell me I can't go someplace, I usually want to go there. And the poverty was very obvious. Huge, huge poverty in New Orleans. In fact, only second probably to Detroit in the number of poor people. And you just have to deal with the reality that you're faced with, or that reality will start to eat from the insides and decay the rest of a society unless you deal with what is happening to people. And we haven't done that very well, and we tend to try to forget about it, ignore it in this country, politically, socially, economically, certainly. And Tom Gumbleton and Norman Thomas and a whole bunch of other folks within the church, unfortunately not enough, but some, are working to spread this gospel of inclusion, to take care of people who are sick, who are hungry. I mean, the gospel is filled with passages of where Christ and the apostles spoke about taking care of those who don't have. In fact, you know, there's something like 3,000 passages in the Bible of social justice. And so, you know, it's not just about building comfortable places for people who are already comfortable and protecting wealth of people who already have wealth or growing that wealth. It's about including everybody. And that's what Vatican II is about. That's what Pope John Paul XXIII was about. That's what Tom Gumbleton is about. And that's what the church should be about. And if it isn't about that, it's going to continue, from my perspective, to lose people. Look what's happening in Central America today. Look what's happening in Latin America. Evangelical churches are reaping huge numbers of recruits at the expense of the Catholic Church. But the Catholic Church isn't addressing the needs of average working people who are struggling in these countries today. And in the United States, the church is losing enormous amounts of support from people because they're not dealing with social justice issues on the one hand, and the church has become enormously conservative on the other hand on issues of inclusion, especially the gay issue, and there are a whole host of other issues as well. Issue of education for poor folks or people who are struggling. Look at the city of Detroit, for instance. I mean, they closed all the high schools. When I was a kid growing up in the city of Detroit, we probably had 150, 180 high schools in this city. We got one left, one Catholic high school left, out of the 180 that we once had, or 150, whatever it was. That's a tragedy. That's a shame, and the church owes it to the community in which it's trying to represent and be a part of, to educate its children, and we're not doing it.
Well, I don't know where to go with that, but you know, there's some parallels between you and Tom Gumbleton, really. You know, you were in the seminary. You're both kind of competitive, I think, in some ways. You know, beliefs. Is it just a Catholic thing, or is it an age? I mean, you know, you're not nearly as old as Tom, but you know, what is it about you guys that are the same? What motivates you, and what do you think motivates Tom?
Well, I think justice really motivates me, and I assume that motivates him because I've heard him speak enough to know that it's a central core of what he's all about. Without justice, often people say there is no peace, and I believe that. There is not going to be peace and tranquility and stability unless there is justice. And so the fight for justice is very, very important. Dr. King understood that well. Cesar Chavez understood that well. Our political leaders, not so well, but some did. Some work for justice. Others don't understand what the word means. And so it's a key component of living. You have to live your life based around that concept if it's going to be meaningful for me and I think for others as well.
Tom, you know, Tom seems like a contrast. He's very public. He's out in front of all these issues and stuff, but he seems more comfortable just praying and being quiet. You know, and it's almost.
I think that's where That's why Bishop Gumbleton is so attractive as a leader, is because he has that kind of quiet spirituality, and it works, I think, very well for him in transforming people into social action, social justice action. Some people are that kind of folk that make that bridge for folks into social action, and some people are drawn to people who, not quietly, that's not the right word, but his demeanor is more Gandhi-like, if I could use a way. I've seen him get passionate, of course. We all have. You can't go to Iraq and see the injustice that was done to 600,000 children who died prematurely because of the sanctions that we basically were responsible for enforcing. Or you can't go to Central America during the 80s and see the injustice that was done to people struggling to get a piece of the pie without being enraged, or Haiti for that matter. And he's been enraged, but he does it within the context of his faith, which is a faith based around a loving and inclusive church. And that's appealing to a lot of people.
Well, I'm not even sure how many trips he's made to Iraq or Haiti or El Salvador, all these different trips.
Yeah.
Has the trips he made, though, called attention to stuff? Is that what motivated you to go, or what?
We've never been on a trip together, although we find ourselves in the same places oftentimes. Iraq, Central America, many of these places that I've been to. My wife likes to say to me, yeah, you were in Congress for 26 years, and people said, oh, you must have been to all these wonderful places, Paris and London, and she often says to people, yeah, well, the only places David ever wanted to go to were the war zones. But, we kind of followed the path of injustice, where it leads, and so we've had this common sense of trying to bring peace and justice to places, or at least push it in the direction that needs to be pushed, the little we can push it together. So I've known him that way. I've known him through listening to him at different events, and I've talked to him on numerous occasions.
Tom has supported the unions with the Detroit newspaper strike and stuff, and it almost seems now that Delphi and Steve Miller are out here to destroy the unions. My dad and all his retiree friends, they've killed the union. They're pretty pessimistic. How will the union adapt? I mean, what's going to happen with that?
Well, the labor movement is in a battle for its life right now. There are a lot of people in this country that want to make America union-free, and they started off with a group called the National Right to Work Committee. I call it the National Right to Work for Less Committee. They're well-funded, and they want to make America union-free. And what progressives have to understand, Gumbleton understands this very well, but a lot of progressives don't in this country, is that you can't have a progressive movement without a workers' movement, a labor movement. It's impossible to do that. And until progressive political organizations, social organizations come to grips with that and fight for the right of people to associate, and that's what unionism is about. It's a fundamental right. It's like the right to religion, the right to free speech, the right to a fair trial. The right to associate is critical. Gumbleton understands that. Bishop Gumbleton does. I understand it. But a lot of progressives don't, and until that happens, you're going to continue to see union density decline, the number of people belong to unions, and that's not going to be good for progressives or for America. We're trying to turn that around by educating people to the fact that, we have 30,000 people in this country every year who are fired illegally for trying to organize at their work site or discipline at their work site. 30,000. That's an enormous number. Back in the 50s and 60s, it was like 500 or 600 a year. Then in the 70s, about 7,000 a year. Now it's at epidemic proportions. And there's a whole union-busting industry built around keeping people out from organizing. If you belong to a union, you're going to get better benefits, better wages, better health care, better pension, 25 to 30% more. Bishop Gumbleton understands that. And that's part of the justice issue. If you want to help eradicate poverty, unionism is a good way to do that because it helps bring people's wages up. It supports them. It's a safety net. You can't live on $5.15 an hour, which is the minimum wage today. That's below poverty wages. You have to work 2 jobs, 3 jobs. And Bishop Gumbleton understands that when you do that, oftentimes you're not around for your kids. And so the whole structure of the family starts to break down. So there's key pieces in this social justice movement, and the right to associate through worker organizations is one of them. The right to fight for good health care is another piece. The right for housing, good education are other pieces. And that's all incorporated within Vatican II and Pope John XII the 23rd. Not specifically in the pieces that I've named, but the concept of work. Even this latest pope that we just lost, Pope John Paul, was a great advocate of workers and understood workers, and did a number of encyclicals on work. Bishop Gumbleton understands how important justice at work is as well. There's a wonderful scripture that deals with the rights of paying wages. It's in, oops, I can't think of it right now. Excuse me.
Isn't it?
Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 22, it talks about making sure that people who live in upper houses with wonderful rooms make sure that they pay their workers fair wages.
Yeah, I think there was Pope Leo the 13th or something had an encyclical.
Pope Leo wrote quite a bit about work, yeah.
Boy, every time I want to go 2 different ways. Let's just finish up this thought. You know, everybody keeps saying we're going through another revolution, just like we went from agriculture to industry. Now,
Yeah.
you know, only the pace seems much faster. And I've got a good friend of mine. He just insists this is natural. We don't need factories. We don't need to do manufacturing. You know, my brother works at the same factory my dad worked at for 40 years at Ford. What's going to become of somebody like him? You know, he's been there maybe 9 years or something. You know, and that's Visteon plant could go away tomorrow. What are people like? What is supposed to happen with people like that that only know?
Well, the manufacturing jobs, particularly in the Detroit area, helped create the middle class in this area. I mean, these were jobs, difficult, hard, dirty, unrepresented jobs in terms of labor representation in the 30s. And people finally said they got fed up with this, and they said, we're going to band together to try to bring justice to the work site. And they raised the compensation for working in these jobs. You know, they were very low-paying jobs and dirty jobs. And through the union movement, they became high-paying jobs with great benefits and great security. And now all of that is being kind of ripped away. There's 2 pieces to that. As productivity increased throughout the 50s and the 60s, American workers' wages in manufacturing in the Detroit area and Michigan generally stayed pretty close with increased productivity. But as you got to the 70s and the 80s, as productivity continued to climb, wages started to decline. And they got wider and wider and wider. And now we have this big productivity gap, which is not good for workers. It's not good for communities, because without good workers' pay and wages and salaries, you don't have the stability and the base you need for a community to grow and to stay stable and provide education and health care and good streets and good parks and recreation. So we've got to get that piece back together where wages starts to track productivity again, so workers can do well. Now, some people make the argument, well, we'll never do any more manufacturing in this country. I don't believe that. You have to be smart at how you do manufacturing. If the Germans and the Japanese can make money and the Koreans can make money in their societies on automobiles, there's no reason we can't do it here. So we have to be smarter about how we do it. We need a national health insurance. Tom Gumbleton has been arguing for national health insurance. I've been arguing for that. Why is that important? Well, first of all, it takes care of 45 million people who don't have it, but also it helps our competitiveness. Without national health insurance, we're paying $1,500 per worker for a car to be manufactured in this country. Our friends across the river in Canada don't pay that. They pay, $300, $400. The Japanese government, same amount of money. The Germans, because all 3 of those countries have national health insurance. Okay? So we're at a huge competitive disadvantage. And we have to start thinking about making smarter automobiles. we ought to, it seems to me, in this state, thinking about hydrogen fuel cells, we ought to be just focusing most of our energy on that, because that's where the future is 10, 12 years down the road. You know, we ought not to be thinking about necessarily just tomorrow or the next year. We ought to be thinking ahead of time so we can leapfrog into the new technologies. That's been the history of the state, by the way, and we're not doing it today. And so there's no reasons we can't be competitive in manufacturing, but we've got to be smarter about it environmentally, smarter about it in terms of productivity, and certainly smarter about it in terms of healthcare.
You know, it seems like people have forgotten a lot of different things. You know, my dad would tell the story when he came from Italy, and he lived in Blair, Ohio, and he brought his mom, and it was snowing, but the snow was black because of all the soot and dirt in the air, and she cried saying, you know, what kind of place is this where the snow is black? You know, and I don't think people remember those stories of how pollution, how terrible things were, and I think they're forgetting this whole point of why the unions came about.
The unions came about because life was enormously difficult. Before there were labor unions, the AFL started, American Federation of Labor, about in 1886, and they were mostly craft unions. You know, your carpenters, your plumbers, your bricklayers, and those kinds of unions. The industrial unions didn't really start to take shape until the late 20s and the early 30s. But before there were unions, basically, industrial unions, I mean, there was no minimum wage, there was no unemployment compensation, there was no worker compensation if you got hurt on the job, there was no health care benefits, there was no weekend. People didn't know what the weekend was until basically the labor movement came in and said, Sunday and Saturday you will rest. It's part of the scripture. You will rest one day. You will enjoy your family and have time with your family and let your body heal. All of these things were brought to the American worker by the labor movement. You know, people marched, they demonstrated, some were beaten, some went to jail, some died in order for us to have what we too often take for granted today. And that's why the labor movement is so crucial. We wouldn't have had the civil rights laws that we've had today without the labor movement, because they're a part of educating and lobbying and being active in Washington and in Lansing to getting the laws that are passed for justice. You know, we wouldn't have progressive candidates getting elected throughout this country if it wasn't for the labor movement. It's an integral part. And people who think it can just disappear and it doesn't matter anymore are fooling themselves. Most people who belong to labor unions don't work in manufacturing anyway. They work in healthcare, they work in public service, they work in retail, they work in a whole host of other industries that are not necessarily manufacturing related.
You know, my dad is always the first to say there's good about the union, there's bad about the union, there's good about companies, there's bad about companies. It's always about balance. And it just seems like we're just way out of balance now, where the companies are just getting everything they want, and the unions just have such a bad name right now that to say, you know, people just assume because you're part of a union, you're overpaid, you don't work hard, you know, and is that part of that perception that
Well, a lot of young people today don't understand the union movement, so that's kind of an open piece now. The labor can define themselves for young people because it's been like 2-3 generations away from what they're all about. And I think the pendulum is starting to swing back to people saying, we need somebody to represent us and fight for us. Because most people don't. They're at-will workers. They work at the will of their employers. You know, they can be fired for any reason. It doesn't have to be just cause. With a union contract, it has to be just cause before they can get rid of you. They just can't, at the whim, decide that they want to let you go. And you're going to get, as I said, better benefits, better health care, all these other pieces. And people are also starting to look at the fundamental rights that Americans should have, and that's the right to association, and there is no more important place in associating throughout the day than at your workplace, and the right to join a union. So these issues are starting to seep back into the conscience of workers. People think labor workers are, you know, people who work in factories or, you know, maybe work in construction, and that's it. People that belong to labor unions are teachers, they're nurses, some of them are in the legal profession, some are in the medical profession, some of them are doctors. Some of them are in the entertainment industry. Some of the biggest stars in the country belong to labor unions today. In fact, the biggest industry that has the largest union density is in Hollywood. It's the entertainment industry. About 60–70% of the people who work in that industry belong to a labor union. So, and it's important to understand that they are really an important part of a community and a fabric in a community. And Bishop Gumbelston understands that. He understands the whole idea of community. That's where he differs from a lot of people. He understands what a community is about, not only a parish, but the different pieces that feed into a parish. A labor union, a peace justice movement, a healthcare movement. All of these pieces make up the fabric of community. And he takes that even further by expanding that through his ministry of justice, whether it be in Iraq or in Haiti or in Central America, because it's the same principles there as it is here.
You know, getting back to Tom, you know, one man, what can he hope to accomplish? I mean, here's a man who goes to Haiti and stuff. What, you know,
He can draw attention to issues. He can educate his flock. He can make a difference. There's a lot of people that have made an enormous difference because they've been willing to be brave and stand out and fight for justice. I mean, Gandhi, King, obviously, the examples, Walter Reuther. We're sitting in the Reuther Library here at Wayne State University. Made a tremendous difference. Cesar Chavez made a tremendous difference in people's lives. Rosa Parks made a huge difference in people's lives. And Thomas Gumbelston is doing the same thing. He's a man of courage, conviction, spirituality, passion, and that comes through. People follow that. They're attracted to that. And those are the kind of people that we need as leaders. We need more of those in the church today. And hopefully we'll have them.
You know, a lot of people say that Tom is kind of a prophet in his time. It looks like I'm going to extend this question. You know, I heard people will say that. You know, we don't realize what we have among us right now.
Yeah.
You know, and in 20 or 30, well, probably in 20 years he'll be 95, or he'll still be alive because he's such a good. But you know, how are people going to remember Tom Gumbelston? How are they? I mean, what are they going to 20, 30 years from now? What are they going to be saying, or what are they going to realize?
A follower of justice, a man of decency, a man of enormous courage, someone who is willing to lead, which is unusual today, in a direction that's sometimes very difficult to take, but necessary. I think he'll be remembered very fondly. But this isn't a eulogy. This isn't a film about what he was. This is what he's still doing, and what he's still doing is fabulous, and who knows what other things he will be able to accomplish and be able to share with us.
All right. Well, I've covered it. Is there something that you wanted to say that you felt, you obviously, we all admire and respect him. Is there something that comes to your mind that you want to make sure that we get out on the tape? Or?
I don't think so. I think I kind of said it all.
Yeah, you've done a lot. I guess the question I have is, you were in the seminary for how long?
1 year.
1 year. And, you and Tom are similar in some regards. Tom saw extreme poverty in Egypt, and it changed him. And was there a moment in your life where you realized that, I want to make a difference, and you decided to get involved? Or what motivated you, or what?
Well, I grew up in my formative years in college, late high school, was when there was a confluence of social justice issues that just came together. It was the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, Vietnam War, the environmental movement, the women's movement. All of this was kind of colliding at the same time, and it was pretty hard if you were alive at all, or if you cared at all, or if your religious training of 12 years of Catholic education meant anything to you. It sunk in to you that you weren't going to get involved unless you wanted to turn all of that off. It was all in front of you. And so when I went to school, I went to the University of Iowa. I was fortunate. I had some athletic ability. I got a football scholarship there. And it was also a place in Iowa City, Iowa, where these issues really bubbled up, social justice issues. And so my interest was really peaked at college, like a lot of people. That's where you get your independence as an individual. You move away from home, you start to think on your own, you expand your mind. And so I started to get interested and involved. I became a social worker. I worked with delinquent boys when I got out of college. Then I got elected to Congress, and I tell people I worked with delinquent men, but but as a social worker, working with delinquent boys, I had 80 on my caseload, which was too many. You can't work with 80 kids. And that kind of drove me to actually run for public office. And I ran for state representative and was elected, and I'm happy to say today we were able to get those numbers down from 80 for probation officers down to what they are today in the neighborhood of around 40, which is still a lot, but a lot better than what it was.
All right, I have one more thing, but now it's gone. Just this whole thing with the Catholic Church. It seems like the very few priests, just in contrasting Tom Gumbleton and Norm Thomas,
Yeah.
These guys, I think Vatican II did shape them, but the priests the very few priests that are coming out today, seem more like bureaucrats or technicians, or I don't know what they are. I mean, contrast, a Tom or Norm Thomas or Tom Gumbleton with what's happening today with these few priests.
I don't know. I hate to speak in generalities, but there aren't enough folks willing to become priests because of the restrictions that the church has placed on the opportunities to serve in the ministry. I think that's one problem. I think the church's position on women is reprehensible and sad. And it misses out on a whole group in our population. Oftentimes the most compassionate, understanding, and the best nourishers of justice and compassion and decency. So it's missing out on so many different pieces that so it's left to a few people who stand out. It's a huge problem for the church. I don't have the answer to that one.
Yeah, I don't think anybody does. But it's just, to me, it's almost like the Archdiocese is waiting for Norm Thomas and Gumbleton to die, and let's get these kind of thorns in our side out of the way here.
Yeah.
And it's a shame, because I look at them, and they seem to have an understanding of what Jesus and his message is all about. And maybe just work that in that, maybe these, because I keep wondering, is it Vatican II? Was it the 60s? Was it, what made a Gumbleton and a Norm Thomas and, Father Singer, these old, what makes them the way they are?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the priest over at St. Hilary, who was really a good guy. Oh, I got arrested with him at the Detroit Free Press. Wonderful guy. Do you know who I mean?
I know nothing.
Oh.
St. Hilary.
I wanted to include him in that group too. He's just a fabulous guy, but
I can call Rita Mary. She'll know probably.
Yeah.
If you want, I can get the name, because she's my little.
Yeah, that would be helpful. I'll think about it in a second, Father.
She's
John, Father John. So. Yeah. Could you call her?
Yeah, let me call her real quick here. Let me just see.
Father
She's in great shape.
Yeah.
He's
Can roll.
okay. Basically, we were talking about what is it about these priests like Father Tom and.
Well, Father Norman Thomas or Father John Nolan or Bishop Gumbleton, they're very special people, because somewhere along the line the teachings of the church, the teachings of Christ through the church, have really entered their souls, and now they speak from the sense of justice, whether it's racial justice or social or economic justice. That's basically where they come from, and of course that's what Christ was all about, was justice. That was his core. And so there's very special people. I wish we need more Father Nolans and Father Thomases and Bishop Gumbletons. With that kind of leadership, the church will find its soul again, and we'll all be better off.